A glowing cross high above.
Jerusalem, the crossroads of faith for billions, is now facing a moment that feels more intense and more dangerous than anything seen in recent years, as missiles continue to streak across the sky, lighting up the city while sirens echo through streets that were once filled with prayer. But while the world watches the war above, something more dangerous is beginning to reveal itself inside the city. The ground trembles without warning, just enough to make people stop in fear. Then the sky changes. A violent storm forms suddenly, hail striking ancient stone as lightning flashes over sacred sites. And when it ends, it does not feel over. Dark swarms begin filling the sky, moving in waves above the holy city. These are not random moments. Scripture once warned that there would be signs in the heavens and on the earth, a world in confusion before the return of the Lord. Are we living in those days without realizing it? If you feel this moment, leave a prayer in the comments and ask God to protect us all. When Jerusalem was already on edge, with sirens echoing through the streets and missiles streaking across the sky, the atmosphere above the city suddenly changed. The shift was immediate. The sky darkened without warning, thick clouds gathering unnaturally fast, swallowing the last light over a city already filled with fear. At first, people thought it was just another passing storm, but within moments, it became something far more violent. Large hailstones began crashing down across rooftops, vehicles, and ancient stone streets, striking with a force that echoed through the old city. The sound was sharp, relentless, almost aggressive, mixing with distant alarms and the tension of war already unfolding. Lightning followed, flashing repeatedly across the sky, illuminating the western wall, the dome of the rock, and the surrounding sacred ground in bursts of blinding light. For a moment, the sky above Jerusalem looked unstable, as if something far greater was unfolding beyond human control. Then came the rain. Heavy, overwhelming, pouring down so quickly that narrow alleyways flooded within minutes. Water rushed through the ancient pathways, carrying debris across stones that have stood for centuries. Shop owners shut their doors. People ran for shelter. Others simply stood still, watching, unsure of what they were witnessing. Meteorologists later said the storm was unusually concentrated over Jerusalem. Locals said they had never seen anything develop this fast, this intense, and at a moment already filled with conflict. And that is what unsettled people the most. Not just the storm, but the timing. Because in the Gospel of Matthew, it is written that before the return of the Son of Man, there will be signs in the heavens and distress among nations. And as the storm began to lose its force, the sky did not return to normal. The rain slowed, the thunder faded, but something remained above the city. The clouds did not fully break apart. Instead, they seemed to gather, holding their shape as if waiting. People who had rushed for shelter slowly stepped back into the open. Many lifted their eyes upward, drawn by something they could not yet explain. Within those dark clouds, a light began to form. At first, it was faint, almost easy to dismiss. But then it grew stronger, brighter, concentrating into a single point before spreading outward. What emerged was something that stopped people where they stood. A human-like silhouette began to take shape within the clouds, surrounded by smaller glimmers of light that seemed to move with it. Some described it as a figure standing within the sky. Others said it resembled the traditional image of Christ, robed in light, suspended above the city that has carried his name for centuries. Phones were raised, videos were recorded. Within minutes, the images began spreading across the world. Experts would later suggest explanations: light refracting through moisture, cloud formations interacting with lingering electrical energy from the storm, optical illusion shaped by perspective and expectation. But for those who were there, the explanation did not settle the feeling. Because this did not happen in isolation. It came after the ground had shifted, after the storm had struck, after the sky had already shown signs of disturbance. And now, above Jerusalem, a form appeared in the clouds, visible long enough to be seen, recorded, and remembered. In the book of Revelation, it is written, "Behold, he is coming with clouds, and every eye will see him." That verse has been read for generations, studied, debated, interpreted, but standing there beneath that sky, many were not thinking about interpretation. Was this simply light shaped by nature? or a form meant to be seen at a moment when the world is already trembling? And just as the sky began to settle, another movement appeared. At first, it was distant, a shifting shadow at the edge of the skyline, easy to mistake for clouds still breaking apart after the storm. But within moments, that shadow grew thicker, darker, and far more defined. Then the sky above Jerusalem began to darken again. Thousands upon thousands of locusts surged into view, forming a dense, living mass that spread across the air above the city. The light dimmed as they gathered, their wings catching what little brightness remained and turning it into a flickering, restless shadow over the ancient stones below. Within seconds, the swarm passed directly over the western wall. People who had just stepped back into the open froze once more. Some shielded their faces, others simply stared upward, unable to process what they were seeing. The sound followed quickly. A constant, dry, vibrating hum, like countless wings cutting through the air at once, filling the space where silence had briefly returned. Waves of insects rolled across the skyline in thick formations, shifting shape as they passed, blocking out patches of light and casting uneven shadows across the plaza. Cameras lifted again. Footage spread within minutes, from different angles, from different streets, all showing the same thing. A sky filled, not with clouds, but with something alive. Locust swarms are not unknown. They have existed for centuries, studied, tracked, explained. But not like this. Not directly over one of the most sacred locations in the world. Not at a moment already marked by tremors, storm, and signs in the sky. And that is what unsettled people. Because in the book of Joel, it is written that locusts would come as a sign, a warning, a call to return before a greater day arrives. A moment when what seems natural begins to carry a different meaning. By the time the city seemed to settle, people began returning to familiar rhythms. Pilgrims moved slowly through the narrow limestone streets of the old city. Vendors spoke in low voices beneath ancient archways. Sunlight rested gently across walls that have absorbed centuries of prayer, war, and waiting. Nothing in the sky suggested disruption. Nothing in the air hinted at danger. Then the ground moved. It was not violent. There was no roar, no sudden collapse, no visible fracture tearing through the earth. Instead, it felt like a hesitation beneath the city, as if the stone itself had shifted slightly out of place. People stopped mid-step. Conversations faded without explanation. A low vibration passed through the ground, subtle but impossible to ignore. Windows trembled softly, hanging lamps swayed. In the open prayer areas near the most sacred sites, people instinctively looked around, unsure of what they were feeling. Some reached for the walls beside them, pressing their hands against ancient stone as if searching for stability. Others stood frozen, trying to understand why something felt wrong when nothing appeared to be happening. The movement did not travel like a typical earthquake. It moved sideways, gliding through the limestone foundations that support the city's oldest structures. It was brief, but it carried a strange weight, like a signal rather than an impact. Then came a sudden gust of wind. It rushed through the narrow corridors of the old city, pushing between stone walls with unexpected force. Dust lifted from the ground. Fine particles spiraled upward, stinging eyes and blurring vision for a few seconds before settling again. The moment passed quickly, but it left behind something harder to explain. Emergency alerts did not activate immediately. Seismic systems outside the city recorded irregular data. Some sensors detected movement, others showed almost nothing at all. The readings did not match what people had just experienced. Videos began spreading within minutes. Short clips showed trembling objects, startled crowds, and people gripping ancient stone to steady themselves. Witnesses described the same feeling again and again. Social media filled faster than official data could respond. Videos appeared, short clips capturing trembling lamps, swaying prayer books, startled crowds, gripping ancient stone for balance. Witnesses began using the same phrase. It didn't feel like an earthquake. And when night finally settled over Jerusalem, many believed the sequence of strange events had come to an end. As the storm faded, the sky cleared, and the city slowly returned to a fragile sense of calm. But that calm did not last, because above the darkened skyline, a faint light began to form. Subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss, yet steady enough to draw attention from those still watching the sky. As the light grew stronger, it did not scatter or shift like lightning, nor did it move like passing aircraft, but instead held its position, intensifying in silence until its shape became unmistakable. A cross, suspended in the heavens, glowing with a soft but undeniable brilliance, its edges defined by light rather than shadow, illuminating the clouds around it in a way that felt both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The city seemed to pause beneath it, as if even the air had slowed, with no wind, no sound, only a strange stillness spreading across streets that had already endured fear, confusion, and unrest. People stepped outside, some raising their phones with trembling hands, others simply staring upward, while a few dropped to their knees, overcome with emotion, believing they were witnessing something sacred, something not meant to be ignored. And yet, others felt a different weight, a quiet unease, as if the sign was not only meant to comfort, but to confront. Because this moment did not come alone, it followed the trembling ground, the violent storm, and the darkened sky filled with movement, forming a sequence that felt too precise to dismiss. In Scripture, it is written that the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and that there will be signs in the skies before a great turning of the age. So the question now begins to rise more clearly than before. If a cross appears above Jerusalem itself, is it a message of hope, or a warning that the world is moving closer to something it may not be ready to face? And just when it seemed that the signs above the city could not grow more unsettling, something began to surface from beneath it. Not from the sky this time, but from the ground itself, in a place where layers of history have been buried for thousands of years, holding memories that were never meant to be easily uncovered. During a routine excavation near Jerusalem, archaeologists came across a stone slab hidden beneath compact layers of soil, and at first, nothing about it appeared extraordinary. It looked like any other piece of ancient stone, worn by time, silent, and unmoving. But as the surface was slowly cleared, details began to appear that immediately changed the atmosphere around the site. The stone was covered with carefully etched symbols, not scattered or random, but arranged with intention, forming patterns that seemed structured, almost like a message. What unsettled researchers was not just the presence of these markings, but the fact that none of them matched any known writing system from the region. There was no connection to Hebrew, no resemblance to ancient scripts that have been studied for decades. Every comparison returned the same result: unknown. The lines were sharp, preserved far better than expected, as if time had not erased them but protected them, waiting for the moment they would be seen again. And that moment is what raised the deeper question. Because this object did not appear during a quiet period in history, it emerged at a time when Jerusalem was already shaken, when the ground had moved, when the sky had changed, and when fear had already settled into the hearts of those watching. In the book of Habakkuk, it is written, "Write the vision and make it plain on tablets, so that those who read it may run." For generations, those words have been understood as something recorded in advance, something preserved for a future moment. So now the question becomes impossible to ignore. If something was written long ago and hidden beneath the earth, only to appear now, at a time filled with signs and unrest, was it simply buried by history? Or was it waiting for a moment like this to be revealed? And by this point, people were no longer looking at each event on its own. Because what had happened in Jerusalem did not feel random anymore. It felt connected. It began with the sky. A storm that formed without warning, dark clouds gathering too quickly, hail striking the city with unusual force, lightning flashing over sacred ground as if the heavens themselves had shifted. Then it moved to the surface. The ground beneath the city hesitated, not in a violent quake, but in a subtle, unsettling way that made people stop, unsure of what they had just felt, as if the foundation itself had briefly lost its certainty. After that, something hidden began to emerge. Objects buried beneath layers of earth for centuries started to appear, carrying markings no one could explain, as if the past itself was rising into the present at the exact moment everything else was changing. And then came the tension that could no longer be ignored. Sirens, missiles, conflict building across the region, turning fear into something visible, something immediate, something no longer distant. Each event on its own could be explained. Storms happen, ground shifts. Archaeological discoveries are not unusual. Conflict has existed in this region for generations, but together they did not feel separate. They followed a direction. From above the city, to the ground beneath it, to what was hidden below, and finally outward, into the world beyond its walls. A sequence that moved step by step, as if something was unfolding in layers, revealing itself gradually rather than all at once. And that is what began to unsettle people the most. Because patterns do not appear without meaning. In the Gospel of Luke, it is written that there will be great signs from heaven and on the earth, moments that draw attention not because they are impossible, but because they happen together in ways that are difficult to ignore. So now the question becomes clearer than before. If this is not random, if this is a sequence unfolding in real time, then where does it lead? And as these events continue to unfold, attention keeps returning to one place: Jerusalem. Not by accident, and not for the first time in history, because this city has never been just a location on a map. It has always been something more, a point where belief, history, and power intersect in ways that no other place on earth can fully replicate. Within just a few hundred meters, some of the most sacred sites in the world stand side by side. The Western Wall, the Dome of the Rock, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, each carrying meaning for billions of people. Each connected to a different path of faith, yet all anchored in the same ground. For centuries, this city has drawn nations, armies, and empires toward it. Not because of resources, not because of geography alone, but because of what it represents. Control of Jerusalem has never been only about land. It has always been about meaning. And that is why peace here has never lasted. Every generation seems to return to the same tension, the same struggle, the same question of who holds authority over a place that many believe belongs not to man, but to God. The temple once stood here, at the very center of this convergence, and even now, there are those who believe it will stand again. That belief alone carries weight, shaping decisions, influencing actions, and fueling expectations that go far beyond politics. What makes this moment different is not just the events themselves, but the way they seem to gather here, in this one city, at the same time. The sky changes here, the ground shifts here, what is buried rises here, and conflict continues to return here, again and again, as if drawn by something deeper than strategy or chance. In the book of Zechariah, it is written that Jerusalem will become a heavy stone for all nations, a burden that cannot be lifted without consequence. That image has echoed through centuries, often understood as a warning that this city would carry a weight the world could not ignore. And as the world watches Jerusalem more closely than ever, another conversation begins to rise beneath the surface, one that does not stay confined to politics or territory, but moves into something deeper. For some, the rebuilding of a third temple is not a distant possibility, but an inevitable step in what they believe must come next. It is spoken of as part of a larger unfolding, something tied to promises, prophecy, and a future that has been anticipated for generations. But not everyone sees it the same way, because the ground where that temple once stood is not empty. It holds layers of meaning for multiple faiths, each one sacred, each one deeply rooted in history. The Temple Mount is not just a location. It is one of the most sensitive and contested spaces on earth, where belief, identity, and devotion overlap in ways that cannot easily be separated. And that is where the tension begins to shift. It is no longer only about borders or control. It becomes something shaped by interpretation, by expectation, by what people believe should happen next. Different groups look at the same ground and see different futures, each one convinced of its own direction, each one carrying a vision that feels larger than human decision. What makes this moment more complex is how those beliefs begin to influence reality. Ideas that were once theological discussions now start to shape real actions, real strategies, real conversations at the highest levels. What people believe about the future begins to affect what they do in the present. And that is where the line between faith and action becomes difficult to define. In the New Testament, there are passages that speak of a temple in the final days, moments where belief and events intersect in ways that challenge understanding. In 2 Thessalonians, It describes a figure who will stand in a place of worship, tying the idea of a temple directly to the unfolding of end-time events. For centuries, these words have been interpreted in different ways, symbolic to some, literal to others. But standing in a time when discussions about rebuilding, prophecy, and Jerusalem are all happening at once, the question begins to carry more weight. If belief is no longer just something people hold, but something that begins to shape the world around them, then where does that path lead when enough people begin to act on what they believe must happen? And as these tensions deepen, something even more complex begins to take shape beneath the surface. It is not just conflict, it is convergence. Across different religions, different cultures, and different belief systems, there are long-held visions about how the world will end, how history will reach its final turning point. These are not random ideas. They are structured narratives, passed down, studied, and believed by millions. Each one carries its own version of what is to come. For some, it is a time of restoration. For others, a period of judgment. For others still, a final confrontation that reshapes everything that came before. These narratives are not just stories about the future. They shape how people think, how they prepare, and in some cases, how they act. And when those beliefs grow stronger, so does the motivation behind them. What makes this moment different is that these narratives are no longer unfolding separately. They are beginning to overlap, not in agreement, but in direction. Different groups may not share the same interpretation, but they are moving toward similar focal points, the same places, the same moments, the same expectations. That is what convergence looks like. It does not require unity. It only requires alignment. And when that happens, history itself can begin to shift under the weight of competing visions, each one pushing toward its own version of an ending, each one believing it is moving toward truth. Jerusalem becomes the center of that pressure, where these narratives intersect most visibly, where belief and reality begin to blur in ways that are difficult to separate. In the book of Revelation, there are descriptions of powers aligning, not because they agree, but because they are drawn into the same unfolding outcome. A convergence that moves history toward a final moment, even as different forces interpret it in different ways. And now, looking back at everything that has unfolded, one truth becomes harder to ignore. None of these events, on their own, are impossible. Storms can form suddenly, the ground can shift, objects can be uncovered beneath the earth, conflict can rise in regions that have known tension for generations. Each piece, taken separately, can be explained, analyzed, and placed into a logical frame. But that is not what people are seeing anymore, because these events did not happen separately. They happened together, within a narrow window of time, following one another in a way that feels structured, almost intentional. First, the sky changed. Then the ground responded. Then what was hidden began to surface. Then the tension in the region escalated, becoming visible, undeniable, impossible to ignore. This is no longer just a collection of moments. It is a sequence. And sequences carry direction. They do not move randomly. They build, they escalate, they move forward, step by step, until they reach something that was always ahead of them. That is what makes this moment different. Because the pattern has not stopped, it has not resolved, it has not reached a conclusion that allows people to step back and say it is over. It is still unfolding. And once again, Jerusalem stands at the center of it all, not just as a place where events are happening, but as a point where everything seems to converge, where the sky, the earth, belief, and conflict all intersect at the same time. History has returned here before, but rarely like this. In the Gospel of Matthew, it is written that these things are only the beginning of what is to come. Not the end, not the conclusion, but the first signs of something larger, something that builds beyond what people expect or understand. For generations, those words have been read as a warning, a reminder that when patterns begin to form, they do not simply disappear. They continue. They intensify. So now the question is no longer whether something is happening. The question is what it is leading toward. Because if this is only the beginning, then what comes next may not look like anything the world is prepared for. And in a time when everything feels uncertain, when signs appear in ways that are difficult to dismiss, one response remains more important than ever. Take a moment to pause, reflect on what you are seeing, and if this message speaks to you in any way, leave a prayer in the comments, asking for protection, for clarity, and for guidance in a world that feels increasingly unstable. Stay aware, stay watchful, because the story unfolding in Jerusalem is not finished yet.